Ancient DNA speaks about our past. New technologies bring to light hidden genetic information, revealing where the roots of the American Indians and Indo-Europeans came from. In the past 2 centuries, archaeologists walked with a hoe in one hand and history book in the other. Their science was, as it were, dedicated to experimentally verifying or disproving what the historians of the past had written or implied. Inevitably, their world stopped where the borders of paleontology began. What had happened in the prehistory of the human race were for them unproven speculations, perhaps even convenient mythologies. In recent decades, however, a colossal change has occurred in archaeology. Tools have transformed art. In other words, modern technology for locating traces of the distant past, much more direct interdisciplinary communication and collaboration, and new possibilities for analyzing genetic material have allowed archaeology not only to interpret its own findings more fully, but also to penetrate the paleontological field. The result is a spectacular transformation, full of unexpected new interpretations of where our hat is. At the same time, however, this information awakens racist ghosts of the past and inflates the snails of nationalism on a planet that is already seething. So how exactly this transformation occurs and where it takes us as a science for reevaluating human history and society is examined here. The announcement of the Archaeological Museum of Salonika in Greece was simply stated the museum, in collaboration with the Democritus University of Thrace, inaugurates the temporary exhibition titled Ancient DNA, A Window to the Past and the Future. The exhibition was inaugurated in July 2015, and the theme was the presentation of modern research on paleontological material, ancient DNA, and its significant contribution to our knowledge of the biological history of man. Such language would certainly not have prepared for a revolution in archaeology if the media had not sufficiently embellished the announcement. Bring lighting, the use of white, blue, and green colors, as well as other interventions, will refer to the atmosphere of a disinfected laboratory environment, while during the educational programs, children to be provided with aprons and masks and gloves. So let's say the archaeology now knows the advantages that DNA analysis has offered to forensics. What does this mean? That a skeleton unearthed by archaeological excavations may reveal the cause of death or even be identified. The discovery a few months ago of skeletons from Shakespeare's King Richard III of England falls precisely into the framework of new possibilities for unraveling the mysteries of history. However, the framework that makes genetic archaeology a real revolution for the field is much broader and concerns the investigation of prehistory as well. And in the issue of Science magazine published in July 2015 on such a shocking discovery as its central theme, when and where the first inhabitants of America arrived in the Americas. To find the answer, the scientists from the University of Copenhagen and Berkeley analyzed a genome sequence of 31 living American Indians, Siberians, and Pacific Islanders, and compared them with those of 23 skeletons from North and South America, with a date of death of 200 to 6,000 years ago, as well as Paleolithic skeleton of a child found in Malta, Southeast Siberia, west of Irkutsk. The conclusion they reached shed light on the origin of the Indians and solved the riddle that had puzzled archaeologists and paleontologists for 80 years. The Beringia conjecture. The glacial migrants. When Columbus first encountered natives in America, he did not need a second thought to call them Indians, since man had set sail for India. But when 50 years later Balboa discovered the Pacific Ocean, and Magellan crossed it, making the first circumnavigation of the earth, everyone understood that the Indians of America had no connection with India. But then, where had these people come from and when? The theories developed by anthropologists, archaeologists, and mediums in the half millennia that followed were numerous and fictionally fascinating. They range from the descendants of Atlantis as Western colonists of ancient Egypt and from North American Minoan copper hunters or South American descendants of the Argonauts to the lost tribes of Israel, as well as immigrants from West Africa or even persecuted by the Vandal Moors. But all these theories, completely fantastic or even with some unexplained findings as a foundation, could not respond to a simple anatomical observation. All without exception, the American Indians had a short and wide skeleton, which indicated an origin from people who had lived for millennia in a cold climate. The first to give the suitable answer was Swedish botanist Oscar Erik Gunnar Hultin, who studied for 3 consecutive years the flora and fauna of the Kamchatka Peninsula of Siberia, the Aleutian Islands, and Alaska. In his doctorate dissertation in 1937, he first formulated the Beringian incubation model, BIM, and according to that, the last ice age 30,000 years ago had created a land bridge connecting Siberia with Alaska. This isthmus, which Hultin named Beringia, is now submerged beneath the Bering Strait, surrounded by a chain of active submarine volcanoes. Based on the flora samples that Hultin studied, he concluded that during the Ice Age, Beringia had vegetation and tundra-like climate conditions, thus constituting a promised land for Siberian animals and the predatory tribes that hunted them. He hypothesized that such populations had flowed into Beringia, but were trapped there for millennia by the glaciers of the Verkhovsk range of Siberia to the west and those of the Mackenzie River Valley of Alaska to the east. It was only when the climate changed, the ice melted, and sea levels rose, covering Beringia, that its inhabitants were forced to flee to Alaska and from there to all of the Americas. The Beringia hypothesis offered a plausible explanation, but it remained without additional evidence for half a century. And then in 2007, a genetic analysis of mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, of 623 samples from 20 tribes of the Americas and 26 in Asia reveals something unique. Most American Indians were differentiated from Asians only by a set of haplogroups, and that they shared. And these haplogroups could only have been formed after their ancestors left Asia, but before their dispersion to the Americas. This would indeed be compatible with Beringian hiatus of millennia around 28,000 to 18,000 years ago. The European Indians, the very recent publication of Danish and American scientists in Science magazine confirmed Hultin's scenario with a new genetic analysis. The vast majority of American Indians descended from a single migratory stream of Siberians from the Irkutsk region who arrived in Beringia no earlier than 21,000 BC and were trapped there for 7,000 to 9,000 years. This was followed by their passage to Alaska, where they left the first findings of their culture, which is now called the Clovis culture, 12,000 to 10,600 BC. And during that period, their separation also occurred into a migratory stream that spread to North America, the Athabascans and the Amerindians, and another that descended to Central and South America, the ancestors of the Oltecs, Aztecs, Mayas, and Incas. The descending of the second stream to Patagonia took them another 2,000 years. All of them, as we said, constitute the vast majority of ancestors of all of the Indians of America. However, were also two genetically differentiated cases, that of the Inuit of Canada and that of some Amazonian tribes. The case of the Inuit had to do with a later and much smaller migration from northeast Siberia around 7000 BC, while that of the Amazonian tribe shows genes similar to the natives of Australia and Melanesia, who are presumed to have arrived in America via the Aleutian Islands around 6000 BC. And as mentioned above, the precise link connecting the current Indians with the Paleolithic ancestors was the skeleton of a child found near Lake Baikal in Siberia, aged 24,000 years. Genetic analysis of both the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome of the child's skeleton shows that the Indians came from the same race as him, but it also shows something else. Up to 38% of the genetic material of the skeleton of the American Indians is of European origin. 38% are European origin. It sounds incredible, but before the genetic analysis told us this, some archaeologists, such as Dennis Stanford of the Smithsonian Institute and Bruce Bradley of the University of Exeter in England, the stone art of making weapons of the Clovis Indians was completely similar to that of the Solutrean civilization that left its traces in Spain, Portugal, and France from 20,000 to 15,000 BC. So if the Ice Age migration that ended up in America had an initial starting point in Western Europe, the question is, what shocking thing happened to those frozen stone ages of the human species that so that they migrated from the Atlantic coast to the steppes of Asia and from there took the Trans-Siberian route? The Indo-Europeans, we have not yet unraveled the remaining frozen secrets of the distant past, but thanks to the genetic hoe, we have begun to understand what happened when the ice melted and the Neolithic Age and the Bronze Age that followed. And as we've all heard, the beginning of the civilization took place somewhere in Anatolia in 9000 BC, where people successfully discovered animal husbandry and agriculture and were finally able to stop moving endlessly behind herds of game to set up permanent huts, houses, villages, cities, and everything that brought about the social organization of states. This new way of life was what spread and founded the first cities in Mesopotamia, the Middle East, Egypt, Europe, were the pioneers, and later being the pre-Greeks, Pelasgians, and Minoans. However, around 3000 BC, a terrible upheaval occurred. The spread of metallurgy brought the revolution in weapons and was combined with the discovery of chariots. Very soon, charioteer and horse-mounted tribes began to descend from the north towards the agriculturally developed cities of the south. The Aryans in the Indus Valley, the Hittites in Asia Minor and Mesopotamia, the Greek tribes in the Balkans. Where had they all come from? Archaeologically, the clues followed the tracks of their horses. As the Harvard linguist, anthropologist, archaeologist, Lithuanian Marija Gitubas told us, since 1956, the germ of the Indo-Europeans was located where horses were first tamed around 4500 BC in the steppes stretching between the Volga, the Urals, and the Caspian Sea. A common feature of their culture was the burial of the dead in mounds. Linguistically, too, the linguo-chronological analysis of the languages spoken over the centuries by the people of the Northern Hemisphere vindicated the British Jesuit monk Thomas Stevens, missionary to the island of Goa in the Indian Ocean, who in 1583 first wrote about the similarities between Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin. As has been demonstrated to date, of the 7,472 languages and dialects spoken on the planet, 445 belong to the Indo-European family, with a common origin and spread from Western Europe to Western China and South Asia. But exactly where this common starting point was and for how long the common Proto-Indo-European language was spoken there before the mounted horde scattered to the four winds and grafted with the vernaculars of the conquered farmers, is something that archaeologists and linguists could not agree on. And finally, answers began to come to us again through the involvement of genetic analysis in both the examination of archaeological finds and in linguistic dating. The whole branch of genetic linguists has emerged, and you can see that in the Science magazine. Now, concerning copper, chariots, and milk, since 1995 there have been at least 12 major publications on the origins of Indo-Europeans, but the first catalytic publication through the genetic analysis was made by Genographic Consortium research team in the journal Science, October 11, 2013, under the title Ancient DNA Reveals Major Stages of Formation of Central European Mitochondrial Genetic Discovery. And they note the process that shaped modern European mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, diversity remain unclear. The initial colonization of Europe by Paleolithic hunter-gatherers around 42,000 years ago, and the migration of Neolithic farmers around 8,000 years ago appear to have played an important role, but they do not explain today's mtDNA diversity. We sampled 364 individuals from prehistoric Central European cultures and profiled their mtDNA to obtain chronological study spanning the earliest Neolithic to the early Bronze Age, 5,500 to 1,550 years ago. And using this to cut time, we identified 4 changes in genetic composition during the Neolithic period, revealing the key role played by late Neolithic cultures, shaping modern Central European genetic diversity. Now, the mass migration from the steppe was the source of the development of the Indo-European languages in Europe, they explained in their abstract. And at the beginning of the Neolithic period in Europe, 8,000 to 7,000 years ago, related groups of farmers who differed from the indigenous hunter-gatherers appeared in Germany, Hungary, Spain, while Russia was settled by a distinct population of hunter-gatherers who were highly related to a 24,000-year-old Siberian skeleton. And in the period 6,000 to 5,000 years ago, farmers in much of Europe appear to be descended from hunters much more than their predecessors, and in Russia at the time, the Yamnaya herds of the steppe were descending not only from the aforementioned Eastern European hunters, but also from populations in Anatolia, that's today Western Turkey. Since the inhabitants of Germany in the late Neolithic age were traced to 75% Yamnaya ancestry, it follows that Western and Eastern Europeans came into contact 4,500 years ago through a mass migration into the heart of Europe from the east. So basically we see that there's a lot of going back and forth in Europe and Russia and the Caspian Sea around there. Now, from what genetic analysis tells us, it follows that 2 major migration flows shaped both the culture and languages of Europe. The first was that of Anatolian pastoralist farmers, shepherd farmers, who arrived in our parts by grafting the existing population of predators, and the second wave was that of the steppe pastoralists, the shepherds who left Anatolia via the Caucasus, had poured into the endless pastures of today's Ukraine and Russia and Kazakhstan, and these later were the poorest compared to the farmers and citizens of the south, but they soon acquired a competitive advantage. They tamed horses and invented the wheel, the cart, and the chariot. In addition, the constant occupation with the herds brought about the genetic mutation that gave them lactose tolerance. Thus, they could now move over long distances in the winter and summer, relying on their horses and the cheese they made from their herds. We know that cheese, they used to put, on the heads of cheese, they used to put wax on the outside. That's the way they preserved it. So the rest of the story is well known. Instead of migrating to find hunting grounds or pastures, the steppe nomads descended in hordes to the places where minerals for their weapons were abundant and wealth was in abundance. And this is how the Europeans reached the ends of Eurasia, from Iceland and Norway into India and China. A comparison of the map of the spread of Indo-European languages with that of the spread of metallurgy is enough to tell the truth. And this concise and simplistic summary of our prehistory is only the tip of the iceberg of what the genetic analysis of archaeological finds still has to offer us. Remember that this has only been around for a little over a decade, this type of DNA analysis. The lesson is extremely simple. The more science gallops, the more meticulous the sifting of its findings must be. Otherwise, the future holds teratogenesis, even originating from ancient DNA. Interesting. Please leave your comments. Thank you for your support. Please support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.